Hi everyone, Matt Vaughn here with the Angularlicious podcast. This episode is about effective Angular architecture. And this is a topic that I've been really thinking about for a long time, several months now, in fact, probably almost a year. And I'm working on finishing a book entitled Angular Architecture, and I'm also speaking at a meetup. The meetup is Angular DC. So when we think about effective architecture, we know what architecture is. It's really kind of the design and the plans of something, right? Is it just that? So when you think of the great architects, or even what modern architects do today, is it just kind of designing and planning something and put it on paper and you have these blueprints? Well, I think it's a little more than that, actually. In fact, when you think of modern day architecture, or even historical architecture, going back to the greatest architect of all time, probably Leonardo da Vinci, it's interesting that he spent a lot of time doing designs and plans and thinking about proportion and thinking about the materials and how he was going to use them and how they would relate to one another and what would he use them for, what is their purpose. So to him, the understanding the goal and objective was very important. And today, we really need to know and understand the goals and objective of what we're building. So if it's a new application, it should have a well-defined goal and objective. So when we talk about the essentials or the effectiveness of architecture, we're talking about three things. The first one is experience. And when you think of experience, I think of people and I think of them having a specific knowledge and set of skills and know-how of doing something. In fact, if you are designing an application or you're a business owner, you probably will need to define what the goal and objective is of what you're building. Who's going to use this application? What are they going to use it for? What's the benefit? What's the benefit to our customers? What's the benefit to us? When are they going to use it? Where are they going to use the application? What are the features and such? And those are a lot of things to consider. And that really kind of falls into the category of analysis and design. I think maybe it's not so much a lost art, but maybe it's something that we just don't consider doing or thinking it's important and valuable enough. And one reason for that is that you might be a very seasoned development team or developer, and you might think, well, I already know how to do that. So I have all the design and information in my head. Well, that's great for you, but what about for the team? What about for the company? What about just going through the actual process, the thinking process of defining who's going to use it, when, where, and when, and why are they going to use it, and understanding these things. And basically, what it's going to give us is the ability to know what we need to build and how we need to build it. So if we don't know these things, then how are we really going to deliver the right thing at the right time to the right people if we don't know these things? Really defining the goals and objectives, that's really, I think, part of the stakeholders, the owners of the company, the product owners would be very much involved in that. But if you're a developer and you're working on an application or even a new application and there's really no defined goal and objective for this app, you probably really should start asking that question so that you can build the right thing. Because it's not really going on a journey where you're hopping in a car and you're just going to go from, I don't know, New York to LA, and it doesn't really matter what route you're going to take or when you get there. If that's the way you travel, great. Sounds like fun. But for most of us, we kind of need a plan. And that's really one of the outcomes of doing this good analysis and design is creating a plan that is detailed enough for the developers to basically start executing work. And they need that. So it needs to be documented. The design, the plan, there needs to be recipes, prototypes, even perhaps even a playbook of how you're going to execute this application, what are the patterns and some of the practices that you're going to follow, and what are the expectations of the development team throughout this journey. So it's a lot to consider. So I'm not saying that we all need to stop what we're doing and join our local domain-driven design meetup and go down that path. But somewhere in between maybe what we're doing today and that is this design analysis, this planning and creating a playbook. And I'll show you kind of what I'm talking about there in a little bit. But basically, we need those things. We need to understand what the patterns and the practices are for the team. So how are we going to do this? One thing that I think is often overlooked during the analysis and design phase and planning is the consideration of the tools and materials that you're going to use. So we're talking about Angular in this case, so we're going to definitely use the Angular platform. We know all the different things that Angular can do, or do we? And what are the capabilities? And some other tools and maybe materials that we haven't considered, perhaps like control suites. Instead of building your own grid control or tables, or maybe copying and pasting that code from component to component, you might want to consider investing in a control suite. Now, there are open source ones, there's free ones, and there's third-party vendors that have different control suites available at different price ranges. So there's probably something out there for you. There's even Angular Material, which is open source. So material design is great. So you're not really starting from scratch, but the selection of these materials and tools basically impact and have effect on the architecture, the design, and maybe some of the features and how the features are implemented. So knowing that in advance will help you make certain decisions one way or the other. So it's kind of like the builders of the Great Pyramids or the Eiffel Tower. If they didn't consider the materials being used, then how would they finish what they started to build? And would what they built be still standing today like we see? So anyway, materials and tools is one thing that we need to consider during this experience part of the equation here. So now that we have mentioned tools and materials, some of the things that we can deeply consider is the Angular CLI. For one, the Angular CLI is very important to us because it gives us the ability to create different parts of our application, even our workspace environments and such. So we can use our CLI to do lots of different things. So what if we wanted to create a new... All right, so let's say we want to create a new project called ASDF, right? That's a great project name. Names are important. But when we create this project, we're going to add routing. Okay, so that's one less thing we need to do. We can decide to use SCSS. And so by using the Angular new schematic, ng new, give it a name, basically what we're doing is we're creating a workspace that has routing for us. It has a default application. It's created and configured the entire application using a very well-defined template. Nothing has been forgotten. We have a default application that is included as well. And maybe we didn't want an application. So let's just call this my workspace here, and I kind of want to know what is available in terms of this. So we can do -- help and understand that this tool has some really interesting capabilities. In fact, we can do no application or in this workspace at all. So we can, let's see here, I think it's called empty, isn't it? Oh yeah, create application. So if we did -- create, was there a dash in there? Equals false, maybe we just want a blank workspace environment. And what it's going to do is rerun that for us. We want it, so that's interesting. So a much less amount of files. It creates an Angular workspace for us, an empty workspace, right? No routing, no applications involved here. So really, the Angular CLI is a very powerful tool and something that we should be aware of and learn how to use effectively. And we can start creating our different parts of our application using the CLI. So if we wanted to add a new project, let's say a new application, right? And maybe this application is for, let's call this our football app, right? ng application dry run, because we don't want to really add it, but we just want to see what the effect would be if we did execute this, generate this application schematic from the Angular CLI. And we'll make the same options. Would you like to configure routing? Yes. It's great. So if you had to basically implement all these files on your own without the scaffolding of the schematic, then it would be very time consuming and maybe error prone and such, and you wouldn't have a working application so soon, right? So the Angular CLI is just one example of something I think that's very powerful in terms of helping us to build or scaffold our applications. And the Angular CLI can create us a new workspace. We can add application projects, and we can add library projects since version 6 of Angular. And it's a very interesting concept, this workspace. So now that we're on the topic of tools and materials, let's just spend a few moments talking about the Angular workspace. So we could run that command, the ng-new command, and since version 6, if we run that command in CLI, basically what we're doing is we're creating a workspace. And the workspace is basically a folder that contains a single package JSON file. And we know the structure of the package JSON file. Basically, it has a name, a version, it has some scripts, some dependencies, dev dependencies, right? But there was something new that came along with the version 6 of this. We now have an Angular JSON file. This Angular JSON file basically is kind of a manifest of all the different projects and the configuration of those projects within this workspace. So let me crack this open. For example, these are all the projects I have in my workspace. You see there's a lot of projects, but there's different types of projects, and I think that's one of the key things to realize here in this workspace environment. We have application projects, and we also have a new project type introduced with version 6 called library. So I think the library project type is one of the key elements of understanding some of the new capabilities of Angular, but it also has a huge impact in our architecture, as we'll soon see. And one of the reasons for this is that a library project is like a package. It's like a package that that we can depend on. A package like our dev dependencies, or our maybe we're using Firebase, or we're using Chartist or Bootstrap. These are just packages, right? Well, our library projects are like packages, but we don't have to go through the entire workflow of publishing these packages to an NPM repository, bringing them down, installing them, making sure we have the correct versions, etc., etc. And really, if you have to do that in managing just kind of the workflow of managing your package, the publishing, the distribution, the versioning, and making sure you're using the right ones. And since they're really designed to be reused, if you have multiple packages and packages are using other packages that use other packages, then you're going to have to update those in order to use those as well. So there's kind of a whole dependency tree that kind of happens. But with Angular 6, the cool thing, the new capability here that you may not understand, is that we have a libs folder, right? And when we create a package, or I mean a new library project, it's just ng, G for generate, or you can type it out. And we're going to make a library project, and I want to call this a logging library, right? And if I wanted to publish it, to share it, I could give it one of those, publishable, and that would mean that I could publish that library just by building it and publishing it to an npm of sorts to hold it. But if I'm just going to create a library just so that I can just share it within my workspace, I don't need to publish it. I can just do this. But anyway, what it's going to do is it's going to create a new project, and it's going to put it in a libs folder. The project name already exists. Oh, it already exists because I've already built one in this case. It's the very same, right? So I have a logging library, and the logging library is just basically allows me to add a logging service, and in this logging service I'm going to have some configuration, and really all I'm going to do is basically log information, a severity, application name, a message, timestamp, just some information that I can capture in my application, and anywhere that I want logging, I can use this library, this package, this library in the workspace. So knowing that you can have projects, a project type that allows you to share and reuse code, may ultimately affect how you structure your code in terms of how you reuse things. So instead of having code that you copy and paste from one component to another component to another component, basically you can put it in the library and just use it once, just bring it in as if it were a package, and you can access it that way. So if you want to just kind of see how easy it is, let's just look at one of our applications, right, that uses it. So let's see if we've got some login here. Features, courses, course component. Maybe we have it in here. Yeah, expense component base, constructor, has a login service. It's the same login service since it's injectable. But how do we reference it into our application? We have this login service, and notice that we have this Angularlicious logging reference here, just as if it was in Node modules, right? And notice that we have a scope here, which is pretty cool. If you're using Narwhal NX, which is another tool, you can have your own scope name, and basically when you create your libraries, just like if they were in Node modules and you have these scope names like so, your libraries will have the same, and you can basically reference them by a scope name. So I know that anything at Angularlicious, these are the packages or the libraries that I'm using within my workspace, and I don't need to, I know where they're coming from. All right, so we're going to basically talk about some of the tooling that we get with Angular Workspace. So one of the nice things about it is that it's one environment. It's like a village where you kind of share the resources and such. And I think one of the coolest things is that some of the resources that you want to share is making sure that your code is consistently formatted in a specific way. So if your team has come up with some rules on how they want to format their code, for example, how long do you want the line lengths to be? Do you want to use single quotes? Yes or no? Do you want to use tabs, trailing comma? So these are the things that you can decide on as a team, implement the rules, and when you save your code, basically all the code for all the projects and all the libraries will use the same rules. So it's kind of like having the same kind of I don't know, city council, government, whatever, and you establish the rules, and basically all the citizens will abide by them. So what we have is basically these rules that are able to be reused throughout all of the projects within this Angular workspace environment. I think another cool thing about it is that if we want to, we can actually do some more automation and basically use a pre-commit hook like a Husky tool, And the pre-commit hook basically will use these rules and apply them in formatting your code when you do a commit to your GitHub repository or GitLab or whatever Git repository you're using. So I think that's a pretty nice automation. If you forget to format your code, you don't have to remember anymore because it's already built into the workflow. So think of it as making sure that everybody's using the same standards, the same tools and such. So tools and materials very important when we're talking about effective architecture because we're keeping things clean and maintainable and consistent, which is a really cool thing. And that's one of the benefits of being able to use the Angular workspace. In addition to that, it's able to share the same configuration for their dependencies. So notice here we're using these Angular dependencies, the 8.2.3, and we see we have some up here as well, right? 8.2.3, and what if you wanted to upgrade to version 9, which just came out 2 days ago on Friday, and if we had 10 library projects and we had 4 or 5 application projects, we would basically have to go to each one of those projects individually and upgrade them one at a time. Well, with the workspace, we just do it once, and our entire workspace and all the projects and libraries basically benefit from that upgrade and are able to basically be upgraded at once together. So it's basically no application left behind, right? I think that's pretty cool. So don't leave an application behind. And we all know that that's really kind of what happens. And we don't want to do that, especially if we spent all the time and energy in the first place in building these applications. We want to be able to make sure they last. And one way of making sure they last is making sure they're maintained and they're kept consistent with current versions that we're using. So keep up those versions, and if you're using the workspace, that's just one additional benefit there, right? So while we're still on the topic of tools and materials, there's other things we need to consider. So we consider really different packages. It could be control suites for our controls. We don't rebuild those things from the ground up when we can actually use a third-party library and such. And I just recently working on an application, and in fact, they didn't use any third-party control suite. They had a table that they customized for kind of their grid display of information, and this table is copied from one component to the next, to the next, to the next, and then kind of customize and customize. So you had this copy-paste code that kind of looked the same, but was very much different. So you really couldn't apply a change or add a new feature to it. You had to go to all the different places. So implementing filtering and sorting, you had to go to all of them and kind of do that. So it was kind of a pain. But if you're using a grid control, that's the way to do it, I think. So really, I guess the point is to think about the capabilities of the tools, what are their characteristics and attributes, and knowing what they can do and how they do it will probably have some kind of effect on the design and the planning and your architecture that you put in place, knowing the tools and materials you're going to use. So it shouldn't be something done after design and planning. It should be done during, because it can affect that, right? And I think there's a lot of tools that we may not even think of in terms of the Angular. I think Angular is no longer kind of this framework. It's a platform, as mentioned before, but it's not like I think it's more than like a toolbox. It's almost like this semi full of tools, and you got things like loaders and tractors maybe, and lifts and such, but you have all these other tools. I mean, we've got the CLI. CLI gives us the ability to do schematics, all these different templates. We have the workspace, library projects. We have these capabilities within Angular to create modules to organize our code. Modules contain services, components, pipes, directives, classes, models, all these different things. We can create these routes, lazy loaded modules with their own routing capabilities. We got routes, of course. We got observables with RxJS. And we have these new patterns that are emerging, like async observables. And so it's very reactive. And our data flows one way, and it's easy to bind data to our applications, right? You want to see an example of that? Let's go ahead and take a quick peek at that. All right, so here is an example of our async observables. So basically what we want to do is have an author observable with author information, and we want to be able to display it in our component, right? So there's my async author observable. And notice in the implementation, I don't really have to subscribe or manage a subscription because the async observable does that automatically for us. So it's a lot cleaner, and all we need to do is just say our authors, which is a read-only, is basically brought to us by our UI service, and this UI service author dollar is our observable of author information. So really the UI service is responsible for the state or the data management of the author information. So the author information as well as the videos information of this course component is not the responsibility of this component to retrieve, right? So it doesn't retrieve that information. One thing, though, that I've observed just by talking through this is that I see that there's a course property that's available. And what's going on is what we're doing is we're subscribing here to the UI service course observable. And then when that happens, we handle that. And basically we're saying, hey, this course is that. So we can apply the same pattern that we did here with these observables, async observables, with this same thing with the course here. So this little mini code review shows me that I kind of have a little defect here, I think, of in this little code example. So basically I want to refactor that. And it's good that I see that because you don't find those things sometimes are not so evident unless you talk through your code. And talking through your code is one aspect of something that happens during the execution phase, which is the third phase of effective architecture, is to have formal and informal code reviews or rubber ducking. So if I was trying to explain this code to somebody like I'm doing right now, I would have saw that and I would have been able to take care of it and refactor that code. So I kind of did my own code review here, and I see something that needs to be taken care of. And the reason for that is you're maintaining the plan, you're maintaining the recipes, the playbook, the scheme that you've decided on as a team to implement things using async observables. You have this one-way data flow, very reactive, and you kind of did an anti-pattern there without doing it. So you can follow the same pattern that I did here, and by using this pattern here, I can apply it to this right here, which needs to be corrected. There's lots of other things that kind of fall into this category of execution. We need to make sure our code is well organized. So take advantage of the things that Angular provides us. So make sure that when you define all the different features of your application, you're creating feature modules that basically organize and categorize the features, but everything in those modules are related to that feature, right? So you don't have anything that's related to customers in the order or shipments module, or anything in the shipments module, you don't find that in orders or customers. So they're very well organized and such. And that's a good way to think about your verticals of your application and start using Angular modules. Now you may be wondering, how do you do that? So if we have our application, one thing I've done here is I have a features folder, and I have a courses module, right, that have all the components related to a course. Then if I had a documentation module, everything related to documentation would be there as well. Now, depending on how many features you have, you'll have as many modules. What's interesting about that is when you create this module approach, you're able to start taking advantage of lazy loading. And when you're doing lazy loading, you can basically load these modules when somebody navigates to them specifically through a path or through a specific route. And that way, it saves on the performance of your application. So if you have a big application with many modules, doing this could be a significant performance increase, but it also helps because it keeps the size of these bundles much smaller. And when you're building your application and when you're delivering that over the internet, then that is certainly helpful to the client browsers downloading those module bundles. So we have the capabilities here to use these different objects to organize our code. What's also interesting is we have the ability to create end-to-end tests using Cypress, which is another capability to ensure that we have high quality